Today, I would like to start an exposition of the letter to the Romans. Romans is a central letter, sometimes called an epistle in the Old English Bibles. It's a central letter to the New Testament. Some say if you understand Romans, you understand the other parts, you understand the entire New Testament. And some people say if you know Romans, you know the whole plan of redemption of the entire Bible. So Romans is a central letter, and we want to go through it verse by verse, passage by passage, and learn what it has to say. The main theme of Romans, which I'll be repeating again and again, is justification by faith. Justification or salvation by faith in what Christ did on the cross. That's the point of it. There's no other work needed by anybody or Jesus himself, but what he did on the cross for us. That is the basis of our salvation. So, as we begin the book of Romans, why don't we ask ourselves, who is the author? It was written about 47 A.D. From the city of Corinth, and let's ask ourselves, who is the author of this great letter? Paul very interestingly gives us some autobiographical facts about himself in the first verse. So let's look at this first verse together. Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated unto the gospel of God. Here Paul gives himself three designations or descriptions of himself. First, he is a servant. Then he is an apostle. Then he says he's a separated one unto the gospel of God. Let's look at these three descriptions one by one. First, he's a slave. In the literal Greek, this is what the word means in Greek, and it should be translated in English, slave. And it's translated like that in some of the English Bibles. Slave. Paul sees himself as a slave to Jesus Christ, obedient to his master. Paul is not one who has gotten these roles reversed like some Christians seem to have done, thinking that Jesus is the slave and they are the master, that Jesus is at their beck and call and should follow their will. No, Paul knew who his master was, and he set himself to be obedient to that master. Now, in the day of Paul, a slave was a mere piece of property in a family. If there was a slave in the family, he was not considered one of the children. He was not considered one of the members of the family. He was considered a piece of property, and he could be beaten. He could be mistreated. From our perspective, it would be considered mistreatment, and he could even be killed in discipline of himself. And so this is how Paul sees himself, as a slave to Jesus Christ, as one who is completely subservient to the Lord. It's interesting that this term that Paul uses for himself is both a term of humility and a term of great dignity. It's humility in that he's a slave, the lowest strata of the society of that day. He's a slave, and he's obedient to his master's call at every moment. But also it's a great title of dignity, because we notice in the Old Testament that Moses and Joshua, for example, and others were called servants of God. And so to be a servant and a slave of God was a great privilege for Paul, and he knew that. But let's look at this obedience which he demonstrated to Jesus Christ, because Jesus was his total master, complete master, and there was no question about it. First, it was an obedience of his will. He was willed. He willed to be a slave to Jesus Christ. He was not one who just was called into this position of slavery by happenstance. He willed to be obedient to Jesus Christ. It was an obedience of his own choice and of his own desire. Second, it was an obedience of discipline. He says somewhere else in 1 Corinthians, one of his other letters, he says, I keep my body in shape so that after I've preached to some, I might not be a castaway. He did not allow himself to get out of shape spiritually or to get out of shape even physically so that he could respond to Jesus Christ's call no matter what it was. You know, there's some of us believers who get out of shape spiritually. I think that God would like to call us and ask us to do something, but we're not in good shape spiritually, and he can't call us. Some of us aren't in good shape physically, and we can't do the work that he would call us to do, like missionary work. Sometimes he calls us to do various things, and he wants us to be in spiritual and physical shape to carry out these tasks as a slave of his. Because all of us Christians are slaves and servants to Jesus Christ. In this sense, we're like Paul. We're to listen to Jesus Christ's call, and we're to follow him no matter what, in an obedience of the will and of discipline. And you remember this obedience, one thing I wanted to say too, this obedience is one of peace. It's a yoke that Jesus says take on himself, and it's a light yoke. It's a yoke of freedom and peace. And Paul knew that he was most free and most at peace when he was completely obedient to his master, Jesus Christ. Well, that's the first thing he calls himself, a servant, a slave to Jesus. Then the second designation he gives is apostle. He says he's called to be an apostle in this first verse. As slave to Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle. Now, only Paul is an apostle here. We can't be apostles. And there were 12 apostles, and Paul was one, because he saw Jesus on the Damascus Road. He saw Jesus personally, and he knew Jesus was risen from the dead, saw him after he was risen. And so he qualified to be an apostle. But he says he's called to be an apostle. Now let's look at this for a second. First of all, he's called. This was a calling of God on his life. This was an inner compulsion in him that he could not resist. When God called him, he had to respond, and he did. The word vocare in Latin means a calling of a voice that comes to a person. And that's what this is here. It's his vocation. This is his vocation, for Paul was called into this ministry of an apostle, and this was his position. He was called. Sometimes we're called to do various things as Christian people, and God calls us. Sometimes God calls us into the ministry. Sometimes God calls us to the missionary field. Sometimes God calls us to do something at our workplace, to speak to someone, to act in a certain way. Well, God calls us. When he calls us, we know it. When God calls us, we know he's calling us. And we can follow him or we can resist him, but we know when he's calling us. And so, like Paul, again, Christians have this same kind of calling, not to apostleship, but to do something for the Lord. The word apostle here, apostolos in Greek, means a sent one. It means someone who is sent with a message from someone else. Usually it was used by a king who would send out his herald to the various villages and cities in his kingdom, and those heralds would speak out and read out a letter to the people that the king wanted to communicate. That's what Paul is. He's one who comes from another authority, Jesus Christ, and he has a message for people. That was his calling as an apostle, and his calling was specifically to the Gentiles. He was to speak to them and to invite them into the kingdom of God. He was an apostle. He was sent. This is interesting because Paul doesn't go on his own authority. Paul doesn't call himself into the ministry. It's not initiated by Paul. His calling is initiated by Jesus Christ himself. And Jesus is the authority behind Paul. So when St. Paul goes out and speaks and preaches to the Gentiles or preaches to anybody, it's on the authority of God himself, Jesus Christ. And when Paul writes a letter like Romans, 1st or 2nd Corinthians, Thessalonians, what he's doing is writing with a delegated authority, an authority from God himself coming through Paul to us. We have to remember that Paul is a sent one with a message from someone else, Jesus Christ. Now, as we move on, we look at a third designation that Paul has of himself. And the third designation is he's separated unto the gospel of God. This is an interesting thing. He's first called a servant. He's then called an apostle. Then he's called a separated one, separated unto the gospel of God. This word separated in Greek means distinct and unique. It means incomparably unique. God had set Paul aside to be separated to do his ministry. This is Paul's purpose in his life. He knows this is what he's supposed to do. He's called out to be separated unto the gospel of God. Sometimes Christians have to be separated like this. Sometimes people will notice this about believers. They will notice that this person does not enter into the talk of the crowd. This person does not enter into the obscene jokes of the crowd. This person does not hang out with certain people. This person is separate, and they will notice that about you, even though you're not explicit about it. They will notice that there's something different about you. There's something separate about you. Well, that's what Paul was to a great degree. He was separated out by God to preach the gospel. That was his ministry. That was his purpose. And this is interesting because Paul, during his entire ministry, was one who was unique and was separated. Down through the centuries of time, Paul has written us these letters and become a figure that has been so fascinating to people that whole books, whole libraries have been written about Paul and his writings, because he was one who God had separated unto the gospel, and he had done his job. Now, these are the three designations that we have of St. Paul as the author of this epistle. He's the author of this letter as a servant of Jesus Christ. He's an author. He's the author of this letter. He's the author of this letter as a called apostle of Jesus Christ, called to do his work. And then he's the author of this letter as one who's separated under the gospel of God, who will do his job. Some people have designated these three titles or these three positions as Paul as a servant or slave as his place before Jesus Christ, his place. He's an apostle, that's his position. And he's separated unto the gospel, that's his purpose. Some people have seen these as three titles of St. Paul, and they're great autobiographical statements about the apostle, and they tell us much about him. They tell us much about ourselves and our own Christian walk. We can line ourselves up and see ourselves as similar to Paul here in all ways. We are servants to Jesus Christ. We are called. We are called not to be an apostle maybe, but we're called to do various things, various ministries. All of us have a vocation that God has given us. And lastly, we are separated. We are separated as Christian people, separated from the crowd, separated from other people, separated from certain practices because we're Christians and our master is Jesus Christ. So let's remember this about St. Paul, the great author of this letter to the Romans. And let's remember that this is who we're dealing with here. This is who is speaking to us. And ultimately, of course, who's speaking to us is God himself. All right, we'll continue the book of Romans in the first chapter next time.